Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today we've got a very special guest, that's Doctor Gary Fettke.
Alex.
And he's a Tasmanian, so he's in studio, which is really awesome. But Gary's someone that I've known for a few years, went to school with his children, and today we're going to talk about the corruption that's crept into the pharmaceutical industry with my background, the medical industry, nutrition and diet. And we're going to tie it all back to, I guess, money, finance, and those things we normally talk about. But I think it's a really important topic because it's affecting people's lives. We all eat food every day. We see the population getting more and more unhealthy, and yet it's sort of Big Pharma and the profits that have taken over, isn't it?
And we can even dwell on the fact that it's different spellings of the word profits as well, because it's not just the monetary one, it's the religious ideology that's actually snuck into our health guidelines for over 100 years, and that education that we've all fallen for, and finding out our textbooks have been written by vested interests for 100 years. That was the eye-opener for me.
Yeah, it certainly was for me. And it's a hard pill to swallow. And there's some things that you think, hold on, how is this not conspiracy? But once you start to research it, you find out that it's very clear this is all factual about how this movement all started out. So I guess today we just ask people to keep an open mind, and hopefully we're going to present both sides of arguments.
I caught up with someone yesterday who said the first time they heard me talk on this was about 5 years ago, and they thought, hang on, this is crazy. This couldn't possibly be right. And yet he's come back to us saying, hang on, you guys are completely right. And everything that will come out that we talk about today is verifiable. Everything that I've said, or that I will say, hopefully will be able to be backed up by, we've got references, we've got the quotes, we've got the articles, and we've got the acknowledgements right across the board. So,
yeah, and pardon the pun, but people are hungry for information. We see YouTube channels like ours and podcasts, they're just exploding with people wanting to talk about these things and learn the truth, because the mainstream narrative and the interests and all that, they're just not really talking about these things, and it's an epidemic we're seeing.
We've got a health epidemic, but it's literally, I will argue, we have literally swallowed the bad information. It's been fed to us by the industry.
Yeah.
And I'll argue that our health issues on the planet, not just at a personal level, but at a pharmaceutical level, at an environmental level, economic level, are largely related to the fuel we eat. And I actually think it's the fuel that we've been told to eat rather than what we've been told not to eat.
Yeah.
So it's not a junk food issue. It's largely that food pyramid has done untold harm, and how on earth we got to that food pyramid, and then where we are.
Yeah,
right
and for people that aren't even qualified or experienced, I guess the thing that I always say to them is just step back and think about this from a common sense point of view. What were people eating for hundreds or thousands of years beforehand? What do animals still eat in the wild? They don't have these huge epidemics of obesity, heart disease and diabetes, and it didn't happen back in the day in human beings either. It really is in recent times.
We managed to very nicely evolve over about 2.5 million years without dietary guidelines. And those dietary guidelines, strangely enough, are actually telling us what to eat to be healthy. And as a society, we've adopted them in the last particularly 50 years, but probably 100 years, with the advent of the processed food industry, who want to sell us a product. And everything I'm talking about, every reason I've gotten into trouble the last several years, is not because I'm telling people to eat real food, it's because I'm telling people to not eat stuff that's in a cardboard box or a plastic bag. And so if we literally drill down on the biochemistry, and I can simplify that in a couple of minutes at some point in time, it is really, really basic stuff. And I've actually dared to rewrite the dietary guidelines on the journey I've been on, which is we need to fuel our bodies properly. We need to eat fresh, local, seasonal food based on our culture and environment. There's a fair amount in that. Reducing added sugar and processed food. And when you actually break that down, that is a low sugar, low refined carbohydrate, real food diet. It means all that stuff in the centre of the supermarkets is in fact not good for us. But I'll base it on the biochemistry and the medical science rather than what I call non-science. And that's what we've all fallen for. Non-science sounds a bit like nonsense, and I'm willing to back that up. Virtually every nutritional study that's been done in the last 100 years is actually non-science nonsense. What you ate 10 years ago is different to what you ate now, or what you eat now. And then how on earth we've drawn statistical analysis across that to say, well, if I ate a red meat burger in 2010, and now I eat one. I eat processed meat here and I eat junk food there. How on earth that extrapolates into my health equation now? It's so open for manipulation, and guess what? That's what happened.
Yeah, so again, today we're going to tackle some big topics about that vegetarian movement, and it's all about can we eat meat in harmony with nature, but we're going to get into all that. But before we do, maybe let's get into your background, your story, because you've had a brush with some of the higher ups and you felt, we hear stories of this in banking and financial industry, but maybe not so much, the really nasty stuff creeping into the healthcare industry as you found out.
I started talking about the perils of sugar about 8-10 years ago. I had my own health journey. I've lost a lot of weight. I had a run-in with cancer nearly 20 years ago. I was pre-diabetes, I had high blood pressure. And I started realising that, in fact, maybe this is the sugar. So I had a journey there of reducing sugar, then reducing carbohydrate. And some years ago now, I described a nutritional model of inflammation. So inflammation sits underneath absolutely everything, whether or not it's heart disease, dementia, cancer, diabetes, obesity. The whole mental health issue is just wide open with this. And so I described that if we combine sugar, particularly fructose, which is half of sugar, with refined carbohydrate, and then we add in the polyunsaturated seed oils, so the canola oil, the sunflower oil, the what's called vegetable oil. Well, there's no vegetables that produce oil. It's just, again, propaganda. That if we combine those three in the amounts that we've done, we actually create inflammation within every blood vessel wall and within every cell membrane and within every mitochondrial membrane, which is actually the engine of the cell. Yeah. So we've created a perfect storm, and if we, as a population, eat that from birth, or in fact mothers feed it to their babies in utero, then we're producing inflamed cells, inflamed bodies right from the word go. And guess what? With inflammation, we've seen this explosion of disease. Now that is just a model, it's a hypothesis. More and more information is coming out to back that, or more, in fact, what's more important is people who do the opposite of that. They reduce their sugars, they reduce the refined carbohydrate, and they get rid of the seed oils, and we go back to the full saturated fat oils, coconut oil, butter, ghee, lard. They are very low inflammatory diets.
Yeah.
And so therefore people who do the opposite of the model of inflammation get better. Yeah. So at the moment, I've been talking about low carb healthy fat, LCHF. It's a low carb movement. It's the current form is the keto movement, which is if you want to take it to another extreme. And in fact, it's not extreme, because I've been having a ketogenic diet and I've been in ketosis now for 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
And I'm still alive, and my brain's still functioning, and I'm still working as a surgeon. So but I'm still ugly, so I can't help that one.
Yeah.
But when I started talking about it, this was a no-brainer to me. This is based on biochemistry, it's based on science, not non-science. And I saw it reverse my own health and start improving it. I saw it improve it for my family, my patients, and then I started talking about it and getting a bit louder. Went on social media, Facebook, a little bit of Twitter. It's the reverse around now. Yeah. And within a short time frame, I started getting picked up by the food industry. Yeah. And then I ended up being reported to the medical board by the Dietitians Association of Australia. I got reported on 3 occasions about advocating that we need to reduce sugar in our diet, and particularly to try and get improve junk food in hospitals. And everyone knows that hospital food's crap. And I had a slide in a talk which is hospital food is crap and it's killing my patients.
Yeah.
And it's a figure of speech. Anyway, the medical board said they actually investigated that slide, and they contacted the hospital to find out how many patients had actually been killed by hospital food whilst they're inpatients. And this is how it started getting spun backwards and forwards. As it turns out, and we didn't really find this out until last year, 2018, that in 2014, the cereal industry here in Australia had myself and others targeted. And so we've come across the minutes of the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturing Forum, where you've got the CEOs of Kellogg's, Sanitarium, Nestle, Food and Grocery Council, Freedom Foods, that sit down at Concord Golf Club every 3 months, and they discuss whatever they need to discuss. But in those internal documents, there is a briefing document that's saying that cereal sales are down because of the concepts of low-carbon paleo. And these 8 people will be targeted, and I was the only medical practitioner on that list. It then had the fact that they were, in fact, at that time, paying the Dietitians Association of Australia to promote and protect the benefits of sugar and cereal. Now, they were in one contractual agreement with one group, and the Dietitians Association of Australia are the ones that write the dietary guidelines for Australia. Now, that's criminal, because here we've got the cereal industry directly paying. We've got the receipts, the Dietitians Association telling us what to eat, and there's the basis of the current Australian Healthy Guideline to Eating. It's the basis of the food pyramid, having all those cereals and grains, and it's actually direct influenced by the food industry.
Yeah, and just to give people some context, that high sugar diet, it leads to type 2 diabetes in a lot of people these days.
Well, I call it insulin resistance.
Yeah.
And an insulin resistant state, insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas to bring our blood glucose down when we eat too much sugar and carbohydrate. So, and there's a whole massive conditions which are related, of which the most common one we hear about is diabetes, but it's obesity.
And what happens there, we call sugar, toxic, and when people hear the word toxic, they think pouring acid on a table and watching it bubble, immediate reaction. But it's over the long term, sugar can really affect, our nerves and all sorts of things. So people can go blind, and people, lose feeling and circulation of their extremities. So you were seeing patients that were having their fingers, toes, feet, legs cut off, weren't you? And then they were trying to get them better in hospital and recover, and they're getting fed ice cream and orange juice and all these sugary things.
It started. I've literally got patients with out of control infection with diabetes, and they've been given 3 ice creams a day. And I said, stop. Just stop. Will you stop doing that? And then I was told, well, that's the guidelines. And I said, well, stop giving them junk food. And then I started coming up against the bureaucracy that, started protecting their own jobs, that nobody's allowed to question, the authority, the paradigm, the guidelines. The guidelines have got to be right. And so I dared to do that, ended up getting reported to the medical board, then being silenced. I was officially silenced. I'm not allowed to give nutritional advice, even if it was shown to be best practice, even though my first degree after my name is MBBS. It's actually a doctor. And so this became an international event, as it's turned out. Social media became, rallied to our support. It took another 2 years of fighting, and I'd love to say being able to get a hearing, but I still couldn't get one with the medical board. So I became involved in 2 Senate inquiries into the Medical Board of Australia. The whole process ultimately was overthrown when it was actually reviewed independently once again, and they threw it out within a few weeks. They said, and then I received an apology. So I'm sorry, we're sorry we got that one wrong. But it was effectively the food industry via the Dietitians Association meddling in my hospital to actually silence someone who's talking about preventative medicine. It's shameful. It's the same thing that happened with the tobacco industry. I just happened to be the target here in Australia.
So we might talk about all the different, diseases or epidemics and how they are caused by food and whatnot. But maybe before we go into how we can get this preventative health model up and running, and 90% of the prescriptions we dispense and patients we see have these, high blood pressure, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, and a lot of this can be fixed by eating a really healthy diet and having a bit of exercise and balance in your lifestyle. But let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, how the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry have grown, and it's become the sick care instead of the healthcare. So whether it's the corporations and how they can make money, or the pharmaceuticals, the way that studies get done these days, and the way that they sponsor the education that people get in universities, students come out with maybe 1 or 2 lectures on diet, and they're not really, they're just not taught. So we see really smart people, kids at the top of their class that maybe aren't capable of independent thought, or they're not going to go and do their own reading into these other conspiracy theories because they trust that what they've read at uni and the medical journals is right. But a lot of that comes back to clinical trials being funded by drug companies to find something that's profitable, and fruit, vegetables, healthy diet, it's all free. It's not profitable, is it?
Wow, okay.
So many things there.
No, but that was in fact a talk I've just given in the US in San Diego a couple of weeks ago. And that was called Medical Education Has Failed the Patient and the Doctor. Do you want the red pill or the blue pill?
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and nut it down, okay?
Yeah.
Our medical education and nutritional education has been hijacked. So we've been told how to medicate our patients by the pharmaceutical industry. We've been told what to feed society by the food industry. And it's fascinating because it's all there in history. And we actually believe what we're told because it's in our textbooks, and we read, and our teachers have told us that. Our textbooks, Harrison's textbook of internal medicine, it's the Bible for most doctors. It's my present for my 18th birthday. Well, last year, the editors of that received $11 million US from the pharmaceutical industry, which they didn't declare. So the Bible of medicine has been caught up in all of this.
Yeah.
If you go back to the turn of the previous century, 1900 to 1910, was a really interesting time because we had influence at that time. We had holistic medicine in place. As it turned out, John Rockefeller of oil and Andrew Carnegie of steel commissioned a fellow by the name of Abraham Flexner to do a thing called the Flexner Report. And he literally went through the universities in the US and Canada, and that was the end of holistic medicine. The money came through, 50 medical schools were closed, and it all of a sudden became, let's test patients and treat them with medications. So we became, rather than educating patients, we became medicating patients. And so that was the birth of the pharmaceutical industry. And if you followed the Rockefeller model, and your university then received Rockefeller money, and it was so influential, holistic medicine was closed down. In the same time frame, in 1917, the American Dietetics Association was formed by a woman by the name of Lena Cooper. Lena Cooper had an agenda. She was a Seventh-day Adventist, vegetarian, working for John Harvey Kellogg's at that time. And Kellogg's had started the cereal industry in the late 19th century. 101 cereal companies were born in Battle Creek, Michigan. And virtually all were actually had from an Adventist background. And here comes the religious ideology aspect. But breakfast cereal, and it's now becoming a bit more common knowledge and partly related to our work, was invented to stop us from masturbating. And sorry everyone, but that's it.
Yeah, and this is something that was pretty hard to swallow, and it sounds pretty conspiracy theory. So maybe just unpack actually what happened.
Okay, we'll go back to the 1860s, the temperance movement, when out of several religions were sort of literally born at that time, and the Adventists were one of them. And it was a time of temperance when men were moving from the country into the cities. You couldn't drink good water, so therefore they drank light alcohol. They used to be away from their families, they'd be drunk, they'd get up to all sorts of infidelity, violence. And so a temperance movement churches sort of were born out of that. Meat was being transported in from the country to the city, but you didn't have refrigeration, so it was actually seen to be unclean and unsafe. So then it was salted, and so because it was salted, therefore salted meat became bad as well. And here's part of that whole myth that meat is bad for you. And so Ellen G. White, who was the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time, started doing a lot of writings and preachings, and we have, born out of that, we have breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Meat causes cancer, meat causes violence, meat causes masturbation, which has evolved now into meat causes heart disease in the 1950s, and now we've got meat causes environmental harm. But it's actually born out of this concept of meat being bad. One of the very strongest strongholds of the Adventist Church and her writings was that if you masturbate, if you succumb to your lustful thoughts, then you will not go to heaven. And so this is a doctrine at the most basic level. Now that was one of her first books that she wrote to mothers. And John Harvey Kellogg was 12 years of age working for the White family and doing the typesetting. So imagine being a 12-year-old typesetting this book, and it's not a big book. We've seen it. It's but nonetheless, he was reading it. If you masturbate, you're going to go to hell. You're going to spend all hell and
so it reminds me a little bit of Game of Thrones. There's a lot of infidelity going on, as you say, and 1800s at the time, people didn't know a lot of, there wasn't the science out there, and they thought that this was one way to stop all that, just to suppress people and calm them down a little bit, I guess, is an easy way for people to understand.
Well, and Kellogg is a brilliant man. He was actually sponsored by the White family to go to medical school. He was involved in setting up the Battle Creek Sanitarium Hospital. Yeah. And that became a 1,900-bed hospital, massive, and it became the model for all Western hospitals that we see now. Every big hospital in the world that you see is modelled off the Battle Creek Sanitarium model. Yeah. Incredibly influential. Patented multiple things, but he patented cornflakes to quell lustful thoughts. He also came up with the first meat substitutes. They were made out of nut analogues. Into the margarines, into all sorts of different exercise regimes, all with the purpose to actually make us healthier. But out of that, we had the cereal industry born, we had the soy industry born, and we had the alternative meat industry born. So people go, who are the Adventists? It's a little church. And I go, actually, they're the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. Yeah, they are the cereal industry, the soy industry, the alternative meat industry, when you get down to it. And they've been writing our dietary guidelines since October of 1917, where Leonard Cooper then started writing the textbooks for dietetics for the next 30 or 40 years. And every Western dietetics association followed suit, the English, the Canadian, the Australian, the New Zealand, South Africa. And then out of all of those groups, we had our food pyramids born. Yeah. We had the food guidelines come to them. Remember, we evolved without needing any of this.
I was going to say, even just zooming out again and asking people to keep an open mind, there's some communities in Asia that don't have all this stuff. It's very common for them to have, a stir fry for breakfast. Their soups or, all these sort of things, broths. In Australia or, in the Western countries, it's a big bowl of cereal covered with milk or toast, and then you have a big bread roll for lunch, then you have pasta, pizza for dinner. But it's just so ingrained in us, isn't it? And it's just not the case in some Eastern countries.
Well, wherever we've introduced Western food, we've introduced inflammation and we've introduced Western disease. Yeah. And you can actually just track it across the globe as we've actually done that whole process. And again, when you sit back, it's not until you actually open your eyes and you go, as I say, once you see this problem, B, the results of intervening, you can't unsee it. And that's why we're on this pathway, because we've actually gone, we can't not stop. And then we've seen the role of influence within that. And effectively, my education has been screwed over, and I'm cranky about it. Because I don't think I'm stupid, but I literally believed everything was in my textbooks because
I was the same. I had a bit of a light bulb moment. For me, I'd started getting really bad eczema, and I was going to the doctor. I was only second or third year uni, and I was trying to find out what is causing this, where's it come from, and I was getting prescribed stronger and stronger steroid creams, and it's just a perfect example of how we try and treat the symptom and not the cause. And once I went down the rabbit hole and started doing my own research, I found out it was diet and a few other things that I was just being told there's no way it could have been that by my doctor. And I think a lot of people go on that journey, whether it's for a more serious illness and they find that there's other possibilities, or there's cases of people curing themselves. But before we get into this can...
doctor is teacher. And to educate was stolen from us in 1910. So we went from to educate to medicate. Yeah. And we're just band-aiding sick care. And that's the frustration. If we go back to root cause, and if you dig down to the root cause, we have the ability to change everything. But that has enormous consequences on the corner store, the agricultural sector, the pharmaceutical industry, the health/sickness industry. And everyone's wanting, this is a thing which I've coming across now and have for the last several years, everyone wants to protect their turf.
Yeah. If you ask a doctor how many patients they've cured each day, they'd sort of look at you and say, what? But it really is a case of coming in to get their prescription, to get their medication that masks the symptoms and that they stay on for the rest of their life as a source of income for the drug companies.
One of the general practitioners contacted me only a week or two ago saying, look, I came to one of your talks a few years ago. I thought I couldn't believe it. Did his own research, had his own health journey, and now he's just got every one of his patients in the practice doing it. And he's just going, I can't believe. He's an obesity practitioner. He's based his practice around it. I got it wrong for 25 years. In the last 2 years, I've seen more benefit, more effect, more patient success, more empowerment of patients.
Yeah.
Than he had in 23 years before that.
But before we get into talking about how this can be a bit of a miracle cure for a lot of things, I want to preface it by saying that both of us are still registered, and I guess the responsibility, the duty is that there are some illnesses that still require medical intervention, and that there's some people that have been saved by some pharmaceuticals, or there's aspects of modern medicine and pharmacy that are still brilliant. But there's a lot of things that could be done a lot better.
This is not the answer to everything, but it should be seen as an adjunct, and probably the first adjunct in most diseases. Think about what fuel you're putting in the tank, and then think about where the medication, the surgery, the chemotherapy, radiotherapy, all those other interventions come into it. This is not to replace them, but it's to give it its pivotal role.
Yeah.
Most of us have got some vehicle. We don't put a little bit of petrol in our diesel engine or vice versa. A little bit in moderation. What a load of nonsense. We know that a little bit of the wrong fuel in our vehicle over a long period of time compounds. And that's what the fuel is.
Yeah, it's interesting, like being a father now with a young baby, you just never dream of putting those sort of bad foods, like pouring a can of Coke into a little one, because they're a baby, but yet we're human no matter how old we are, and we're pouring all this food into us. But I want to get into how it can really benefit and reverse a lot of illnesses. So there's some fantastic documentaries out there. You're actually in a few of them the other day. I was watching one, you popped up again, Gary. But I'll ask everyone to leave in the comments below their favourite documentaries about this stuff. But one that opened my eyes was Reversing Diabetes in 28 Days. And if you told, again, medical students when they graduated, if type 2 diabetes was reversible, no, it's just not in the textbooks anymore.
Well, see, I disagree with that, because I think you can reverse type 2 diabetes or put it into remission in 6 hours.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think you need to wait 28 days. We've just done that with one of the local radio announcers, and put a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, on his arm, and tracked his food, and literally the moment he stopped eating sugar and carbs, his blood glucose came under control. And the moment he ate them again, it went up. And I've used the monitor myself, I've experimented on myself. But you don't need to experiment, you literally watch what fuel you put in and watch your blood glucose jump.
Yeah, so let's give people a quick little science lesson at home. So blood glucose should normally be between 4 and 8, and depending on...
I'll go even further back.
Okay,
right.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about a wood fire.
Yeah.
Because I think if you can understand a wood fire needs what to burn?
Yeah, wood.
Wood, good. We're going to keep it simple, all right? Sorry, I've known him for a long time, since he was a kid, so I've got to go back. So a wood fire needs wood, and into that wood fire you can put in kindling, branches or logs.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you put in kindling, you've got to go up, down, you've got to open and shut the door on the wood fire, on the firebox. And then with branches and logs, they burn slow and steady. So we understand that concept. Back to our cells, here comes the biochemistry. The mitochondria are the engines of the cells, and they require a fuel called acetyl-CoA. Yeah. That's the common pathway into a thing called the Krebs cycle. ATP comes out of it, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy of life. Yeah. And that's not just humans, that's animals as well. So ATP, Krebs cycle, unique. Into that acetyl-CoA can be sourced from carbohydrate, proteins, essential proteins and healthy fats. And it will actually go in there very nicely. There is no essential carbohydrate. There's no biochemical pathway in the body that is dependent on glucose, which is half of sugar, or fructose, which is the other half of sugar. Not one. Because you think carbohydrates are normally seasonally available. They come naturally. The only way we can eat them is in fruit. They come in grain after they've been milled and ground down and processed. But fruit is only seasonally available. There are entire climates that don't have fruit. And in fact, the climates that have more fruit have actually got more sunshine, which is actually, we need vitamin D to actually synthesize some of the byproducts of fructose. And I've just drifted down a pathway. But that's why I talk about in that food guideline based on your environment. So the closer you are to the equator, you can probably have a bit more sugar in your diet. The further you are away from the equator.
Again, it's getting back to what we said at the start about being balanced with nature. But I like that analogy of the kindling and the logs on the fire.
So if you put carbohydrate into the cell, into our bodies, we actually need to open and shut the door regularly. That's called insulin. We need carbohydrate comes in, blood glucose goes up. Insulin is secreted by the pancreas to drive it back down and into the cells. And once the cells are full of the fat which is produced in that storage mechanism, they can't store any more. And then we put more carbohydrate in, more insulin. The body ultimately, the pancreas starts packing it in, failing, and that's called insulin resistance. And the flow-on effect from that is a whole lot of side effects. Whereas the proteins and the healthy fats, which we definitely require for our metabolism, our cell healing, our storage, the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and E and K are hugely important in our bone metabolism, calcium metabolism in and out of arteries. We need to have fat in our diet, and we've got a society that's been on a low-fat diet for the last 4 or 5 decades, and as a result, we've got osteoporosis, heart disease, and all the other issues. And we couldn't have tried harder to screw it up, but we...
So again, making this really simple for people at home with that fire analogy, I'm glad you interrupted me because that was better than the example I was going to give. We can break down proteins, and amino acids, fats into products that can fuel our bodies. It's a bit of a myth that we need to have carbohydrates and sugar for energy or for your brain and that sort of thing.
That 130 grams a day for the brain to function was literally made up.
So when people go on these fad diets, they feel terrible and they don't have energy because sugar is more readily available. It spikes in the bloodstream. But
you use the word fad diet. I completely agree. It's a fad diet. It's food against diabetes. But it's not a fad diet. The only fad diet we've actually been on is actually the one we've been experimenting with for the last 50, 60, 100 years.
Sorry, when I should say, when people make that big change, this is the point I want to get to, is that they feel terrible and lethargic. And your body doesn't have these on and off switches where it says, oh, this person's been eating sugar and carbohydrates every day. Now they've decided to eat a lot more protein and fat, and that flicks a switch. Your body is a biochemical machine that needs to start to ramp up those processes it hasn't been using. So that's why people feel terrible and lethargic when they cut out of those foods overnight. Do you think that's...
I think that's part of it. Part of it's a fueling issue. Part of it's a metabolism. But the simple thing is sugar gives you a high. It's got all sorts of chemical reactions at a place called the nucleus accumbens in the brain and the hypothalamus.
And it releases dopamine.
Which is involved in our appetite and suppression, but it actually makes us feel good.
Yes.
And so therefore it is a drug. It's like the soma that's talked about in Brave New World. It's actually the drug we're all having. And so you can see this if you give kids sugar at a party. This is the example. You give kids sugar at a party, they go troppo, they go crazy running around, and a few hours later they're flat and depressed and cranky.
And it gets metabolised into a type of alcohol. Is that correct?
Well, that is one of the pathways. The fructose part gets converted via an aldehyde pathway literally into alcohol. And when you have refined carbohydrate, you have too much carbohydrate in your diet and you move into that insulin resistant state, 30% of the glucose you have, the bread, gets converted to fructose as well into the liver, into the alcohol, but also into the small dense LDL particles, what's loosely called the bad cholesterol particle. And so we've actually swamped our bodies with sugar, 30% of the carbs that come into fructose as well. We've swamped the aldehyde pathway. We've swamped our cells into producing more fat, insulin resistance, and we've produced the one particle associated with heart disease that we know of.
So before we get into fructose and LDLs, which I want to talk about, that for people at home, that's that post-Christmas, when you're passed out on the couch or when you have a big bread roll at work and then 2 or 3 o'clock, you just feel so lethargic after a real heavy carb meal, isn't it? That's what you're describing. Yeah.
And you can see it in nature when I've seen some great videos of monkeys just going on a fruit-eating frenzy, and then they're lying around drunk afterwards. Yeah. But it is actually chemical. It is actually alcohol that's produced, and that's what we make wine out of. Fruit.
Getting back to the dopamine is addictive, the chemical that's released with addictive drugs, cocaine, that sort of thing. This is a problem we see obese people, and maybe this ties into depression and neurochemistry a little bit as well. I think I've heard you talk about. But once they're on that path, sugar is the only thing that's giving them that dopamine and that pleasure feeling, and then they put on weight, and you talk about replacing joints in your surgery, then it becomes hard to go for a run and exercise, and it sort of all cascades and ties into each other, doesn't it?
It does, and my issue is that there's this misinformation, or I call it disinformation. Misinformation is mischievous. Disinformation is deliberate. You've only got to walk, out of the supermarket, and you're bombarded with bright, shiny wrappers advertising itself. I mean, I don't know if you've seen my fruit talk, where fruit is advertised to us in nature as well as in the supermarket as being better for us than it really is. I'm not anti-fruit, just understand that if you're going to eat fruit, have it fresh, local and seasonal, and understand that it's going to drive behaviour. It's going to make you hungry for the next few hours after you have it. And it's got a high sugar load. And in nature, it's meant to advertise itself to us so that we eat the fruit, so we dissipate the seed. The fruit hasn't worked out that we drop most of that seed into a porcelain bowl now. And so because I often get accused, you're anti-fruit. And I say, no, if you're going to eat it, make certain you have a small amount, make it out of your garden, and make certain you get sunlight exposure to metabolise the.
And if we go back to the thousands of years model, what people have been doing, fruit is that bright substance in nature when maybe there wasn't other food around or abundance, and people are out there scavenging in the sun to find fruits, and it all makes sense when you think about it from common sense point of view.
And fruit gets effectively turned into fat. When you have fruit, which is mostly fructose and some glucose, or depending on the fruit, it is meant to actually be eaten. So in nature, we are driven to find fruit, the only real natural source of carbohydrate, so that we can turn it into fat for winter hibernation.
Yeah.
And you can see here possums will strip a tree bare of the fruit 2 or 3 days before we want to eat it. But that's their survival mechanism.
Yes.
So we, at the most primitive level, we are driven to find sugar for our survival. And then once we become addicted to it, and we then go past the food industry's advertising, then we're caught.
So it was rare in nature, and now it is abundant. 80-90% of the shelves in the supermarket, and people load up and it makes them feel good. It's in our biochemistry to try and survive for the coming winter, those sort of things.
Nutrition science, we'll come back to that. The Adventist Church have actually said that nutrition science was born with the Adventist message, because they've in fact started nutrition science. And whenever you hear about the benefits of vegetarianism, it's always the Adventist health studies that are quoted. They re-quote themselves 1,200 times on studies which are actually dodgy to start with.
Yeah.
So but you keep perpetuating the myth.
Yeah.
But so nutrition science was born out of the food industry, but the food industry have tried to improve the palatability of the food, which is that bliss point, just get the perfect taste, the perfect amount of sugar, the perfect amount of fat.
Yeah.
Chocolate is the perfect bliss point food. And so the food industry have used science, nutrition science, to drive the palatability, the profitability, the shelf life, the transportability. And somewhere along the line, we as health professionals fell for that, thinking, oh, that's science based on the scientific method. Well, it's got nothing to do with it. It's a commercial decision.
When you go to the US, even the bread and the tomato sauce, everything's got this hot, like it's really sweet. And if you're a healthy person, you can taste that. But for them, a lot of people, it becomes that normal sweetening taste that's in the background.
Well, coming back to the effect of sugar on your taste buds, it is an overwhelming sensation, because we're again driven to find it, and when we find it we want more so we can get fat for winter.
Yeah.
When you actually drop sugar out of your diet, a whole lot of taste comes back, and so your ability to enjoy food is actually it's a bit like smokers giving up smoking. They can actually taste their food again, and so if I have literally an apple now, which has got literally about the same amount of sugar as a can of Coca-Cola. Nobody likes to hear that. Mm-hmm. It's about 10%. That is almost too sweet for me to eat.
Yeah.
Because my taste buds have been accustomed to not having sugar for so long now.
Yeah, I'll never forget when we did our own little veggie garden at uni and eating those carrots, and that's something that you grow yourself. It almost tastes like naturally really sweet and flavourful when you grow a really healthy vegetable yourself. Yeah. So let's get back into, later on we will get into corporations and how the studies are funded for food and for pharmacy. But let's talk about fructose and then LDL. So the high fructose corn syrup, there's 100 different types of sugar on packaging in supermarkets.
Again, if you can put different sugars into a product, then you just need to list them by percentage rather than just saying, hang on, this is sugar and your product is sugar. Yeah. You can effectively look at that and say, look at the carbohydrate amount. Australian labelling's a bit better than US labelling. From that, we actually look at it per 100 grams, so you can use a bit of nous and work out percentages. Whereas US labelling and some European labelling is really quite misleading. They talk about, it's got so many grams per serving size, so you're going to have to start doing some pretty complex mathematics. Fructose metabolism was actually only described definitively in 2010, 9 years ago. So it's sort of been known there in my biochemical textbooks, and probably yours as well. You actually looked at it, went fructose 6-phosphate, and then nothing else. It sort of just we forgot about it. We didn't,
and that right there is a good example of how quickly everything has evolved since the the industrial era, where money and corporations grew really quickly, and maybe the science and the biochemistry and these studies, as you say, the fructose pathway has only been described recently, and yet boom, it's out there. Everyone's eating it every day before there's been any studies done on it. Really.
And one of the major describers of that, one of the papers that changed it for me, Luc Tappy, Luctappy, nice guy, I've met him, but he described all of the potential complications of it. Well, he's now sponsored by Coca-Cola to go around the world saying that fructose by itself is not the only cause of obesity and modern disease. And I completely agree. It's not the only cause. But, I've actually quizzed him publicly on that, and I said, but and in his paper there's a great little thing that says, if we could ever show that it is a problem, then he might need to change his mind. Well, that paper's being done. I actually questioned him about it 4 days afterward. Robert Lustig did a paper on adolescent obese children with what's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is where the liver's starting to develop into the problems of cirrhosis, end-stage alcoholism. Guess what? Alcohol pathways, all there fill up with fat.
Which we spoke about before,
yeah. So Robert Lustig did this great paper where he did what's called an isocaloric exchange of fructose for glucose. They got all these fat kids to eat exactly the same number of calories, but just switched the fructose to glucose. And within 6 weeks, all of these children reverse their fatty liver disease. So fructose is toxic.
It is.
And certainly in the amounts that we're having in society.
It is shocking. It was shocking for me to learn about type 2 diabetes. It's a disease that when you've had too much sugar, like a chronic disease is the way we sort of think of it. But now we see kids getting it because they've had so much sugar by the time they're 10 years old, which is just insane. And there's also information out there now about mothers and having it in pregnancy, and you start to build the epigenetic picture, isn't it, for your young one, that they get conditioned to the environment that they're about to come out into, don't they?
And so we know that children of women who have gestational diabetes, that pregnancy diabetes, have a much higher rate of obesity, have higher rates of diabetes themselves, and actually have higher rates of mental health issues, which it's another whole pathway. And the thing is, it's completely preventable. And we're not talking about a disease of modern society because of a complication of society. We've got a disease of modern society based on what we eat and because of what we've been told to eat, and what isn't advertised to eat. If you want a little bit more science about diabetes, there's a favourite topic of mine called the Maillard reaction.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah, I have, but you're going to refresh my memory and it's all going to come back.
Because everyone knows the Maillard reaction. It's when you brown a piece of food. So
of course, cooking steak, yes.
It's a cooking, Maillard.
Yeah.
So you drop a piece of bread in the toaster, you heat it up, and that's the Maillard reaction. And what it is, it's the combination of glucose with the protein under the effect of heat to cause glycosation. It's almost a caramelizing. It's not quite, but it's...
Yeah.
And so that's a browning or toasting. Now in diabetes, and this is the most simple way to understand diabetes, diabetes is the inability to tolerate the carbohydrate load that you have. So when you eat carbohydrate, your blood glucose goes up, your tissue glucose goes up, the glucose in your tissue then combines with the protein in your tissue under the effect of body heat, and the Maillard reaction occurs. So every time your blood glucose spikes in diabetes, you are toasting your brain. You're toasting your eyes, your kidneys, your legs, your vessels, your heart. That is diabetes in a nutshell.
We're gradually hardening the arteries.
And just like a bit of toast, it's getting harder, crispier.
And heart disease, the leading cause of death still, I believe, in Australia and the US. We see cholesterol and fatty deposits on the walls, but this all ties back to sugar, causing inflammation, mild reaction, and cholesterol is actually the repairer, isn't it? That's almost like blaming the fire truck for causing the fire, because it's always there when you rock up and see that a house has burned.
Yeah, and so then we've got all these cholesterol-lowering drugs to actually solve the problem. It's a bit like reducing funding to the fire brigade.
Yeah, statins. Let's talk about statins, because they are, I think it's 3 or 4 of the top 10 most profitable drugs in the world are statins. They are everywhere. At one stage, they are looking to put them in the water supply in the US. It's just insane.
And they're trying to introduce it across the shelf orders, in pharmacies in the UK just this week.
Yeah.
I just come back to the basic premise. Whenever I ask doctors, and most people, I say, well, okay, you want a cholesterol-lowering drug. What are you worried about? And they say, well, my cholesterol goes up. I say, well, okay, what is cholesterol? And the scandalous, and I'll say it's scandalous, 99% of doctors can't answer that question. So we've got one of the highest selling drugs in the world with this enormous fear campaign about it, without the people writing the prescriptions actually understanding what it is.
For people at home again, cholesterol is the lining of every cell in our body.
Well, it's a major structural component of our cell membranes, our mitochondrial membranes.
Yeah.
It is a precursor to multiple hormones, including our sex hormones.
All our neurochemicals, the backbone is
neurochemicals,
cholesterol.
Vitamin D, and it's about making up 25 to 30% of our brain. So why on earth do you want to go on a drug to reduce your brain function, your hormone function? And it's well and truly associated with higher rates of dementia, diabetes, and now cancer.
100%. And some of those are really well covered up or misreported. I know firsthand, I've seen a lot of elderly people lose their memory. It's kind of this common thing, but it's not necessarily true.
25% of people will get muscle and joint pain with it, which means they need to stop it. It's not a drug which people take for a long time. There's quite a lot of literature saying that people stop it. 40-50% of people stop it within a year because of its side effects. Yet it's continually pushed out. There are studies saying that it can reduce that small dense LDL particles. They're few and far between. Virtually everything is association data in relationship to cardiovascular disease. And the biggest study, out of the Oxford group in the UK, they will not release their data for independent review. And 2 years ago, 3 maybe, it was found out that they received over £100 million from the pharmaceutical industry to do the study. Now that study effectively said, and this is how it advertised to doctors, and then the doctors passed it on to patients, that if you take a statin, it will reduce your risk of heart disease, of dying of heart disease by about 29%. What it actually showed was that if you're male over the age of 50 and if you have a heart attack, it will reduce your absolute risk of dying from about 1.2% to 0.9%, which is around about 29% relative risk. So it's advertised to us as consumers, doctors and patients as a 29% reduction.
Yeah.
Now that's the best study that's quoted, yet they still won't let that data out for independent review.
Let's talk about those independent reviews and the data and statistical anomalies when something shows a 50% reduction from 1 in a million to a 50% reduction from 1 in a million isn't, people get excited when they hear 50%, but statistically it's...
Right, and if you want to look at the longevity associated with it, and I've got some papers say that you actually reduce longevity, but again, out of that Oxford study, you're effectively saying that when you look at the data, if you take this drug for 10 years, you're going to increase the chance of living for 4 days.
Yeah.
With all those other side effects which are not brought up at the time of,
So just quickly, let's go back and talk about high density and low density, because these are things that people get quoted their numbers and their cholesterol. They get very confused, but you sort of maybe explain to people briefly what they are and how they can be very essential to what's going on in the body, and we're trying to suppress one.
Well, I don't think we should be suppressing anything. I think if you put the right fuel in the body, then the lipid profile works itself out.
Yeah.
Long and short of it. And so they started measuring cholesterol, I think back in the 1920s, 24, something like that. And cholesterol started getting blamed for heart disease because you could see it down the microscope. You could see that there were plaques and they had cholesterol in it. So cholesterol was bad. You could measure it. So we started measuring it. So we've got all this really lousy data, which has been sitting around based on what you did eat and you didn't eat. Again, there are papers out there that say the higher your cholesterol, the greater your longevity, the better your mentation, the better your thinking, the lower your rates of heart disease, and diabetes. And I've got, again, papers showing that if the lower your cholesterol, your total cholesterol, the more likely you are to get cancer, diabetes, and die young. Well, this is not what's told. And so all we hear in the, well, not all, but the vast majority we hear in the media and what comes to us from drug reps is the benefits, and we hear one side of the argument. Same with the environmental issues. Virtually everything you uncover, you find out the media is giving us one line of propaganda.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I'm right. I just happen to know I've got papers that say that the exact opposite. So therefore, if I'm finding that there's two sides to the equation, I'm going to do my own research. I've got my own health journey. Fueling my body has given me a perfect lipid subfraction analysis. Yeah. So that costs between $80 and $100 here in Australia. So it really means toss out that standard lipid profile that people have.
Yeah.
The only things which are possibly useful are some ratios on there rather than actual numbers.
Yes.
Or maybe the triglyceride number, which is an indirect measure of the small dense LDLs, which are the ones which seem to be most trouble.
Yeah.
And do a thing called a lipid subfraction analysis. Find out your total profile of how fat and protein's been distributed around the body.
Yeah.
And so rather than talk about good and bad cholesterol, I almost don't want to buy into it.
Yeah.
Because I think if you're buying into it, you're playing the game of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. I think what I'd encourage people to do is just to understand those different lipid profile numbers they get if they're on these medications. And like everything we talk about today, we're not telling people to go out there and stop their medication. What we're telling people to do is get on this diet, try eating this way, and then there's no better feeling than going to your doctor and say, hey, I'm doing all these, all my numbers are down. This is a vast better improvement than any medication could have done for my numbers.
the rates of reducing small dense LDL and reducing triglycerides, reducing diabetes are infinitely better by changing your diet than by any medication. The best medications that can reduce, let's say, diabetes, when it's got a test called HbA1c, it's talked about percentages. Most of the medications might reduce your rate by 0.5, maybe 1%.
Yeah.
I've got patients that reduce their percentages by 3, 4, 11, 12% over a couple of months. This is it, but there's no money to be made in it.
This is the perfect segue into talking about how the studies are funded and what the studies set out to accomplish. So it's slightly different in different countries, but an oversimplification for people at home is when a drug company wants to prove something, or maybe even a food study wants to prove something, they normally test it against a placebo or a blanket, something, a measuring stick. And all they have to show is that it improved. So when someone has diabetes or high blood pressure, they give the drug, and if they can show that it reduced it a little bit, that is effective. And what we see in practice is people coming in with high blood pressure. One medication worked a little bit. Oh, we'll try it too. They end up being on 3 or 4 medications, and they all bring them down a little bit. So in the studies, they show that they're effective because they're better than doing nothing to bring it down a little bit. But as you say, if someone eats super healthy and does exercise and whatnot, their numbers can get down far
just
more.
Back to hypertension, high blood pressure. If you drop sugar out, that is incredibly effective, because fructose has one of the metabolites of it is uric acid, which is, most people may have heard of uric acid being associated with gout.
Yeah.
But uric acid is also an inhibitor of a thing called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is the thing which allows our vessels to dilate. It controls the blood flow to our brain and controls how our immune cells move around. So if you have a high sugar diet, you increase the uric acid, you increase the effect on nitric oxide. So therefore, doing the reverse again, you don't have the sugar, people's blood pressures come down.
Yeah. So for people at home, nitric acid, I think there's the kids do the party poppers at the festival. It opens up all the blood vessels. Yeah. And it's the same for people when they have a heart attack. We give them under the tongue, and it opens up the blood vessels.
That's how Viagra works.
Yeah. So this is the natural way of opening up the blood vessels, keeping blood flow healthy, that sort of thing. Yeah.
So, we can even segue into that. I mean, sexual health improves. I mean, a great story, promises true. This woman came in to see me with a knee trouble, and I walked in. She's in her 50s, and she came in and she said, first up, she said, Dr. Fettke, look, thank you so much. My husband's erection is so much better.
Yeah.
And I'm not kidding. And when you start listening to people, if you actually improve your health and well-being, you improve your weight, you feel better in yourself, your mind improves, you become empowered. And a side effect, we started to run a little course for men and women's health about the benefits for men's health, that they find their gut comes down, improves a whole lot of health, well-being, erectile dysfunction, which is the first symptom of cardiovascular disease.
It's a funny topic, but as you say, circulation to the extremities, cholesterol, blood flow, all these things are so important. And this is a good example of people go, my erection, my blood flow is better. And you say, well, this is because of all these things we're trying to teach you.
And women's thrush disappears.
That's one that we used to see a lot in practice with high sugar diets and things like that as well.
And again, it doesn't cure everyone, but it's a significant thing that you should be thinking about. Menopausal symptoms seem to be a lot better for women who actually reduce their sugar and carb load. Again, not a cure, but wouldn't you try this at zero cost before you try a drug?
Yeah, so do you want to maybe talk about the studies a little bit more? And the early studies, I think sometimes it's on mice, and we just want to make sure that something's not toxic. Phase 1, we try it on a small population of healthy individuals. Then the studies get bigger on a broader audience. But do you want to maybe talk about how you think about those studies, how they get funded, what they're trying to prove, and then how it becomes a profit?
Well, I'll use 2 very recent examples of the research being compromised. And one is out of Sydney University and the other one out of University of South Australia. Both up for investigation of academic fraud at this point in time. So there's a massive, and this is relevant because it's taxpayers' money involved, particularly the Sydney Uni one. So Sydney Uni researchers had $1 million to look at different diets on longevity of mice, because they'd done some insect work. They had a belief that low protein diets were going to be beneficial. They got $1 million to look at 30 different diets. Interestingly, and I don't want to sound like always cognitive dissonance, but several of those researchers had ties in with the Adventist philosophy of reducing meat. If we can reduce meat, then we can reduce protein, and that's one way of doing the study. Anyway, they published the results. Sydney Uni were right behind it, did full-page advertisements, some of the newspapers saying that low-protein diets increase longevity. Some of your listeners will have heard about it. Got an enormous amount of airplay around the world. Media releases and the like. As it turns out, they reported 25 different diets when they started with 30. And the 5 groups that died at the beginning were on low-protein diets where the mice had to be euthanized, because they were so malnourished that they couldn't actually enter the study group. And 5 of the top 7 surviving mice groups, and actually the ones that did the best, were actually on low-carb, higher protein diets. So they dropped 5 inconvenient groups out. Then they misreported it. Sydney University then ran with it. This was front page of The Australian a couple of weeks ago. And as a result of that wonderful study and all that advertising, the university, Charles Perkins Centre, has been granted another $13 million worth of NH and MRC funding based on fraudulent research. So again, they started with my money, they started with our money, and now they've got 13 times as much of it based on literally made up results.
And once this stuff is out there, it's already systemic, the diet pyramid, and it's just, how do you report it or change it? Like the guy that gave the talk, you can't pin it down to just fructose. It's very hard to pin it down to one. Like even smoking industry, they fought it for years until there was an abundance and you just couldn't overturn it. Then they looked for profits elsewhere. But from the pharmacy side of things, an elderly person comes in and says, "Oh, my memory's so bad," and a lot of the time it can be that cholesterol medication. But then to report that side effect, it's a fair bit of paperwork, and there's all these barriers where once this is out in the real world, it's just so hard to overturn it.
And that's where a forum like we're talking about now is getting out to another group of people. And that's why I'm happy to chat on podcasts. This is why we're still involved in social media, because someone will go, that seems reasonable. I'll look into it a bit further. And as I say, don't have to believe me. We've got our stuff out on the internet, but start questioning. Yeah. And if it doesn't make sense, question.
So a calorie is not a calorie. This is something you touched on before when you spoke about fructose versus sucrose, versus carbs and fat. Can we talk about these? How many calories a day to have is another thing that's come out. But I want to talk about those healthiest populations in the world that live over 100. There's plenty of places that eat a very high fat, high protein diet, Eskimos and whatnot. So just maybe talk about how you think about that macro balance and the nutrients, the vitamins and minerals, that side of things as well.
I have very little carbohydrate in my diet. What gets into me comes in with the meat that I eat, and the small amount of vegetables that I have, and maybe a few berries, and a bit of dairy. But it's very low in carbohydrate, and it's generally not processed. Often people say, "Oh, what percentages?" And I get accused of being the laid-back low carb, because I actually don't know. I know I have a very low carbohydrate intake. My insulin levels are very low. My pancreas has been on holiday for 10 years. My insulin resistance is way down. Once you're in that state, you will listen to your body. I will wake up some mornings and go, I want protein today. I want fat. Yeah. And so therefore I will eat protein, and I don't, and I'll eat fats. And I know that's really nerdish, but that's the way I'll sort of go to the refrigerator.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the wood fire and go back to the mitochondria. A wood fire doesn't care where the wood comes from. Our mitochondria doesn't care whether or not it's carbohydrate, protein, fat, and it doesn't actually care whether or not it's animal-based or plant-based.
Yeah.
So an animal-based diet and a plant-based diet can be accommodated in this concept.
Yeah.
I think it's harder to do it just if you're animal-based, and I think it's hard to do if you're just... I think it's much harder to do plant-based. I think it's hard to do animal-based, and therefore it's about actually having good, healthy sources, pasture-fed, holistically raised.
Yeah, so veganism has exploded in vegetarianism, and there's a couple of sides of it. There's the people that think that meat is really bad for you. Now, there's those that don't want to see harm to animals, and we certainly respect everyone's opinions on all these topics. We're just trying to open people's minds. But then there's also the mass production thing, which I think is the most important. So I think that you can enjoy animals as part of a balanced diet if you're consuming them in balance with nature, the way that nature intended, farming it holistically, whatnot.
Respectfully, regenerative agriculture is a huge term at the moment about actually not sustainable agriculture, but regenerative.
Regenerative, I should say. But
to push, let's drag our carbon back into our soil.
Yeah,
and put the biodiversity back in the soil, retain the moisture, the organic matter.
But I think the thing that when meat and dairy, one of the things that they get a bad name on that I think they deserve to is the mass production. Pumping them full of growth hormones, antibiotics, and these bad conditions. Then it isn't surprised when people have bad reactions to some of these dairy products or to some of these chicken products. So I kind of, again, is that something where you think that that's not black or white? There's exceptions.
As a society, we've done exactly what we've been told to do for the last 50 years. There's some really good US data, and I think Australia and most of the Western world follow reasonably suit, looking at 45-year data of what we're supposed to consume. And of that data, we've actually increased our cereal and grain intake. We've increased our fruit and cereal intake. We've increased our protein intake, and we've decreased our red meat and our dairy consumption. That's sort of what our guidelines have said for us to do.
Yeah.
So when people say, we've got these epidemics because people aren't doing it, well, actually, as a society, and it's US data, we've done exactly as we've been told. So we've increased our white meat consumption because of the chicken farming, and Belinda and I were in the US recently, and I thought, because my takeaway food is a roast chicken.
Yeah.
Okay, a whole roast chicken and because I think when you're travelling, it's hard. But so we went to in California, the best whole food store had a roast chicken. It was awful. So I don't know what they're feeding their best chickens in the US, but we couldn't eat it as distinct. So I'm concerned about the best whole food chicken I could buy in the US was not palatable, and I think that's probably part of this whole issue, which is I suspect it was still commercially raised.
People forget that animals can taste what they've consumed, and particularly if you're hunting game, and people just get so out of touch with what's happening when they see these foods in the supermarket. I love watching the shows about the best sushi chefs, and they'll talk about where the fish is caught, what time of year, what they're eating, all that sort of thing, and we just completely forget what we're eating, don't we?
Well, if we get our our meat products, so if they're fed grain and they're fed food which is high in the seed oils, then the omega-6, omega-3 ratios, which are the inflammatory oils, particularly the omega-6, go up. So a grain-fed beef is not as healthy as a pasture-fed one.
It's almost like a sick human being, like the cows are getting, high cholesterol, diabetes, and then we're eating that meat.
But then if we actually go completely plant-based, our soil is losing its micronutrients at the moment. We've lost organic matter. We've lost 80% of our organic matter in our topsoil in the last 100 years. The magnesium, a lot of people are taking magnesium supplements.
Yes,
but we're actually needing to take them because our soil that's been fertilised is now when you add potassium in fertiliser, which is a very common component to it, it binds to magnesium. So our soil is now depleted of essential minerals. So you might even want to eat properly. I don't want to be depressed about it, but just pragmatic. You might be thinking you're eating really well, but our soils and our foods are now much lower.
I think we're so lucky in places like Tasmania with farmers markets where there are people that are farming, really sustainably. But I'm not sure what the term is with that crop turnover where they're repeatedly just trying to pump out as much as they can, cover it with fertiliser, and that is just so out of touch again with nature.
Well, that's the monoculture issue, and it is largely related to grains, sugar, soy, and the grains, the wheats, the cereal crops. And sure, a significant amount of that is going towards animal production, but a lot of it's actually going to processed food. And that environmental footprint is enormous. And I come back to that organic matter in the topsoil. The single greatest agricultural export at the moment on the planet is topsoil.
Yeah,
it's been blown away, it's been washed away because we don't have the organic matter there. We don't have the grasses holding it, the ground together. Yeah. When water lands on it, it doesn't hold, it goes away.
Natural bacteria and the mixes of all that in the soil as well.
That's all gone.
Yeah,
it's literally all gone. So the health of our the wealth of a nation is measured by the wealth of the health of its people.
Yeah.
The health of the people is determined by the health of the food that they eat, and the health of the food is determined by the health of the soil. And if we don't look after our soil, we're not looking after our food, we're not looking after our environment.
Is this an overpopulation thing? Have you thought about this much, that if we continue to grow at this rate, it is almost impossible to feed the number of people with the right diet?
I think the proper human diet, I like that term that came up recently, the proper human diet.
Yeah.
To make us proper human diet that's sustainable for us and sustainable for the planet.
Yeah.
Which does happen to be LCHF, and it does have an integral role of having meat in the diet, both from a health nutrient point of view and from an environmental aspect. The carbon footprint of animal husbandry is just been so manipulated by vested interests. And I'm not saying that I'm right and others are wrong, but when you start looking, there is a flip side to all of the literature thrown out by movies like Cowspiracy. And when you start thinking about it, we've got so little arable land on the planet, 3 or 4% decreasing. Our monocultures, for whatever reason, we're losing that ability to produce food. As a result of that, but we still have so much food wastage.
Yeah.
It's just so dumb. We've actually got enough food on the planet to feed people on the planet.
We're starving people, yeah.
And we're just distributing it badly. And so the other thing is, when you start looking at the integral role of ruminants, which are cattle, sheep, goats, bison, and farming them on grasslands, they think this, which is not opportunistic to put crops on. Those grasslands are 20% of the planet, and we can actually look after them better by not overproducing on. This is called regenerative agriculture, because those ruminants eat grass. Grass actually comes from carbon dioxide, and it sequesters the carbon dioxide out of
the same as the rainforest, the lungs of the planet.
But we literally then turn it back into the organic matter that our topsoil is missing. I use the term, hashtag, innocent cows. The cows are not the problem; it's the humans.
Yeah. In the Bitcoin community, there's a subculture of carnivory where they believe you can only survive on meat. So, biochemically, is that a macronutrient thing where you can, but it's the micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals where you still encourage people to eat vegetables?
The carnivory movement is interesting. Yes, you can survive just on animal-based diet.
Yeah.
The Eskimos are a great example of that, where they literally, guess what, introduced, processed food to the Eskimos and the Inuits, and
diabetes,
diabetes, cancer, everything went up. And if you are respectful and you eat what I call tip to tail, so you are eating the organ meats. You're not just eating.
And they have more of the water-soluble vitamins when you start to eat all the other organs.
Yeah, the fat-soluble. Like I think a lion in the wild will go along and it will eat the organ meats, the brain, the offal, and it will eat the fat, and it will then leave the meat. I think it's interesting in itself. So the nutrient-dense food.
But are the water-soluble vitamins in there somewhere as well? Where are they getting their water-soluble vitamins from if they're only eating meat?
Really interesting. Like we all believe we need vitamin C. There's some work showing that if you don't have carbohydrate in your diet, or very little, you actually don't need vitamin C. Whoa, that's a blow-away thing.
Yeah.
But, of course, the Eskimos didn't have scurvy, but they didn't have any carbohydrate in their diet.
Okay. Interesting. I wanted to look into that more.
Yeah, no, but it gets off on another tangent. So a lot of the things we're told that we need, the nutrients we're told to eat, like carbohydrate, glucose for the brain, vitamin C. Well, actually, biochemically, those vitamin C dependent pathways are actually only dependent on the pathways which are involved in the, not only, but significantly involved in the pathways that are metabolizing carbohydrate.
Cool.
So that's science. That's not non-science. This isn't association study. That's what's happening at a laboratory level.
The next thing I wanted to talk about was gut health. Another thing that's really exploded recently, and I'm not sure if I disagree with you on this one, but that's why I want to talk about this more. So I think gut health is fairly important. People don't realize that the human body is made up of, let's say, 1 trillion cells, but you've actually got 10 trillion, 10 times more bacterial cells in your gut. It really is being seen as an organ. Now, is this something where if we eat a balanced diet, we're going to have a nice, healthy gut flora? Or is this something that's been caused by inflammation from sugar? Or what's your thoughts on gut health?
I'll come back, because I'll tie it back with the last. If you get a tablespoon of dirt, it's got about 7 billion creatures in it.
Yeah.
Which is about the same number of creatures on the humans on the planet.
Yeah.
If you get a tablespoon of feces, it's got about 7 billion creatures in it.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting, 1 tablespoon of dirt equals 1 tablespoon of feces, which is one planet worth of people.
Yeah.
Oh, just trivia.
Yeah.
Okay, but just put it
No, because people don't think about these numbers. People think their gut is this pipe, goes in, comes out, but it's actually a very active, alive organism.
It is. Well, it's critical to our health. What fuel we put in at the top is actually then turned into fuel that can then get into our bloodstream. And having a diversity of organisms in the gut allow those processes to occur, and then certainly some of the whole mineral breakdown, vitamins are all generated out of that, and having a healthy gut microbiome.
Yeah.
Traditional cultures, even which haven't been exposed to Western food, have a greater diversity of gut bacteria than those in our Western society.
Yeah.
And arguably they have more resistance to a whole lot of things. I actually use the term diversity breeds resistance. And monocultures breed weakness.
Yeah.
And so if you put a diverse amount of fresh food into your body, then you're going to have a diverse gut microbiome, which makes complete and utter sense. The more chemicals you put in at the top end, whether or not it's pharmaceutical or in the food processed food, the more it's going to affect the gut health. But I think it's absolutely critical to our health to have a diverse gut microbiome.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah.
Okay, I'll start with that.
Yeah.
Critical. But I think a lot of the noise we're hearing about the benefits of gut health come from the fibre side of it.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. Yeah.
You've got to have fibre, Well, guess what? You don't need to have fibre in your diet to actually have a good...
Well, if you're eating a bad diet and you don't have fibre, you're going to have issues. But if you're eating the good human diet, then you don't need fibre.
Proper human diet, you don't need fibre. And there's some good information out there on it on YouTube. Paul Mason's done a great talk on fibre, so has Zoe Harcum, both of them well worth watching. And while people are writing that, Ivor Cummins, CUMMINS, has done some great talks on the cholesterol, shortish ones to introduce.
Yeah.
Here's my take on the fibre one.
Yeah.
I reckon it's cereal industry based, all the noise we're hearing, because the cereal industry are under pressure. Breakfast cereal, full of sugar, full of carbohydrate. I know I've got their internal documents saying low carbs affecting profits. back in 2014. Imagine what they're doing at this point in time. So the last bastion of that, you must have cereal, is fibre. Last year, the Assistant Minister of Health here in Australia, a fellow by the name of David Gillespie, did a press release on the benefits of fibre for our health. It was written by Kellogg's. It wasn't his independent research, it wasn't his department research. We've got the Assistant Minister of Health for Australia getting out there saying fibre's good, and it's written by Kellogg's.
This is a good example of someone, when they even do the study for this, if they have everyone eating the Western diet and then the people that have fibre, they might have better bowel habits and whatnot. So they're saying, see? But what we're saying is it's more complicated than that. If you eat the healthy human diet, you can avoid all this altogether. So that's where it's hard to get these messages across, isn't it?
Whilst the fibre gut microbiome cholesterol thing, I mentioned the University of South Australia. Sanitarium, our most trusted brand owned by the Adventist Church, not paying any taxes in Australia, funded a study out of the University of South Australia where looking at cholesterol levels. And one person out of 45 had a reduction of their cholesterol level by 9%. 1 out of 45. 4 had dramatically elevated cholesterols, which were put to the side in the study. Sanitarium then gets pays via the Heart Foundation to endorse the product, and it comes out with advertising that if you eat this Wheat Bix, no, that doesn't even have an asterisk. It will, if you eat this Wheat Bix, it will reduce your cholesterol by up to 9%. Now that's a factually correct statement.
Yeah.
Like one person in 45, it reduced their cholesterol for what that's worth, and I don't even think that's I think that's a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
But they advertise it as such, based on a study which was funded by Sanitarium to promote their product, endorsed by the Heart Foundation, and all of a sudden the lay public will go along and pick up their packet of Wheat Bix because fibre's good and this is going to lower my cholesterol. And it's completely manipulated.
Well, I think we've separated the fibre aspect of the gut to the microbe aspect with that, which is good to know. But for people at home, I think that the gut health is so interesting. A lot of the studies we're seeing now with doing the fecal transplants where they get some healthy matter from a healthy gut and put it into someone with an unhealthy gut, and they actually see not just better digestive but all sorts of other side effects. 90% of our immune system is in our gut, so I think it's really interesting.
My concern, and again there's some work on this, is that if you drift back to the bad diet, your gut microbiome will drift back as well.
Yeah.
Not completely, but I don't think we've watched that long enough yet.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if you're in dire straits and you've tried everything, some of the fecal transplants are clearly showing benefits.
Yeah.
Clearly. But how did we get there in the first place? So again, that's a band-aid treatment. Fecal transplant sounds great, I can restore it all, but that's not the root cause.
Yeah. So let's keep talking about microbes and immunity. And there's some research showing how sugar affects the immune system and our survival mechanisms. Do you want to maybe touch on some of your thoughts on that?
Well, we touched on one before, nitric oxide.
Yeah.
Nitric oxide is allows a white cell, an immune cell, to go and do its stuff. So if you have a cut or an infection or something, or a cancer, particularly the T cells, they go to the area of damage and they actually do their job.
Yeah.
If you inhibit their ability to get there, then you're affecting your immunity.
Yeah.
That's the long and the short of it. And it appears to be an integral pathway there is nitric oxide. Interesting, some of that inhibitory effect can be affected by vitamin C. So maybe there's an argument for having the vitamin C to affect the nitric oxide. But then if you don't have the carbohydrate, you don't produce the nitric oxide in the same fibre. But going back, there's a great paper in 1972 that's been buried, which actually looked at the effect of sugar on what's called the phagocytic activity of neutrophils, which is their ability of them to do their job and actually get active.
Yeah.
Particularly relevant to me as a surgeon, because what happens is if you give and again, it was a human study, so it wasn't, not a big number, but if you gave people sugar, and it was only a small amount, about 40, 50 grams, it inhibited those cells from doing their activity for about 6 hours.
Yeah.
And if you fasted, you actually improved their ability for 72 hours. So one of the things that drives me crazy is my patients wake up after an anaesthetic,
yeah.
and I want their immune system to be absolutely fired up and doing everything, and they're given fruit juice, ice cream, jelly, white sandwiches,
yeah.
and a chocolate chip biscuit. And I go, this is the one moment I actually want them.
Is that the fight or flight, sort of like survival, your body's in survival mode, repair mode when it's fasting?
A few years ago I described the biochemistry of religion, which is really sort of a strange thing to do, but in all religions embrace fasting, which is nutritional ketosis. And it's seen as a time of cleansing of the soul, cleansing of the body, time of spiritual awakening, greater awareness. And that's what fasting does. That's what nutritional ketosis does. So in nutritional ketosis, part of that is our white cells are functioning better. And so it's been observed for thousands and thousands of years, as long as we've had a religion, that there's been fasting. Now that may have fitted in with the seasons, like Ramadan particularly, and arguably Lent in the Northern Hemisphere. So therefore it does fit in with a time when there wasn't a lot of seasonal food around. So okay, why don't we just embrace a bit of religion and a bit of fasting at that point, have our spiritual awakening. So as a society, we've observed the benefits of nutritional ketosis for thousands of years. I'm only putting a name beside it right now.
Yeah, again, so for people at home to maybe give a bit of an overview, the body has so many different ways to fight off bacteria, viruses, different types of infection, even cancer. I don't like the word cancer because there's many different stages of cells that are dividing abnormally, and your body has mechanisms to repair those and do it, back up that damage. But what we're doing when we're eating this bad diet is inflaming the body. A lot of these diseases almost feed off the sugar, don't they? We have studies showing that I think cancer tumours really like consuming sugar.
There's a biochemical pathway that the more aggressive the cancer becomes, it travels what's called the Warburg effect, where it tends to consume an enormous amount of glucose. However, from a cancer point of view, one of the biggest drivers of cancer is insulin. So insulin is a growth hormone. It's the thing which pushes glucose into our tissues, but it's a growth hormone. So having a low insulin diet means that you're not promoting the tumour growth and hopefully allowing the body to fight a bit better. So ketogenic diets are now being considered in some cancer managements, and there's I think 12 current clinical trials around the world at the moment. Don't know the results of them all, not to cure cancer but to be seen as having an adjunctive role. And certainly my reading on it, and I've done some talks on that, show that it has beneficial effects on making chemotherapy and radiotherapy more effective. So again, it's partly the glucose effect, but you'll never get rid of glucose out of the body because our liver will make its own glucose. But you can certainly take the insulin stimulant effect away. Do
we have many studies around Parkinson's, Huntington's, other sort of degenerative diseases of the brain linked to sugar and plaques in the brain, that type of thing?
Absolutely, particularly in dementia and Parkinson's. Really exciting area, and the neurodegenerative disorders. And there's a fellow by the name of Stephen Kinane who's done some work on this, and I think he's a good first stop in finding the reading. Again, the brain is not dependent on glucose for its function. It can run just as efficiently on ketones, which is what effectively healthy fats are turned into ketones, ketone bodies. And in dementia, for example, there's a poor metabolism of glucose in the parietal lobe, which is sort of about here. And that parietal lobe has a hypometabolism of glucose, but it actually has a normal metabolism of ketones. And Stephen Kinane's done some work on there where he's gotten people who are in fact unable to work because of dementia. They've stopped working because of it, and they switch over to a ketogenic diet, which is about long pathways in epilepsy management, a lot of work on that. And they get better to the point they go back to work. That may not be a good thing, but anyway, but nonetheless, their cognitive ability And we've got some personal stories in our close family of seeing the benefits of changing diet. And you don't have to be hardcore, but if you actually, first thing is reducing the sugar and the carbs. And if you can get into a full ketogenic diet, you just don't know the potential. And in dementia, for example, the spouse is often the one who's controlling the cooking. They're controlling the food. Why wouldn't you try it for a month or two?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen and I've heard the stories, and this is where you have to be careful, because people get out there on YouTube and Google and they hear these case studies of one person that this diet cures cancer or whatnot. So we're not encouraging any of that, but we're just saying that why wouldn't you try to eat healthy, what people have been eating for thousands of years when these diseases weren't abundant? I think that's the simple message, isn't it?
And we are seeing, everyone says, you're getting better at diagnosing cancer and getting better at picking all those up. But we're seeing increasing rates of cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease, inflammatory-related diseases in younger and younger people, and particularly in the Indigenous communities. So we're not saying they weren't there, but why are we seeing diabetes in children, as you were referring to? Why are Indigenous communities having enormous rates of diabetes, renal disease, kidney failure? And you know what the answer is into our Indigenous population in Australia at the moment?
What is sorry?
The answer for kidney disease in the Indigenous population in Australia, let's put in more dialysis machines. And the funding's going, and that's it, an enormous push to put, what about, let's get back to what they're being fed.
I just don't know how people can not see the epidemic around them. Like, I know you become the environment you're in or the people you're around with, your friends and whatnot. And we're pretty lucky. We've got healthy friends, common sense, well-educated people. But when you read these numbers, and Australia became the number one obese country in the world a few years ago, and then America leapfrogged us again, I believe.
It's a fight to the bottom. In fact, it's interesting how we become Western-centric. I've seen the world data on it. The top 10 or bottom 10 highest rates of diabetes in the world, of obesity in the world, are actually the Polynesian countries. The Blue Pacific, they are struggling underneath this. And there's an argument for that, because the more you drifted across on your raft across the Pacific when they were not developed, where they started, you needed to be more insulin resistant. You were able to store fat more. So the moment you start introducing refined carbs into that population, they're more likely to get it. So the top 10 of the world fattest populations are the Blue Pacific. 9 of those top 10 are the 10 highest rates of obesity, of diabetes in the world. Number 10 that pops one of them out is Kuwait. And Kuwait pops them out because they don't have no alcohol, so they've massive sugar-sweetened beverage intake. So they've got a massive soft drink intake.
That is crazy, isn't it? And we see it here with Indigenous populations as well. They're just not used to that, and when they diabetes and whatnot, it just goes crazy.
At younger and younger ages.
I mean, how do people change this? You start by voting with the food you eat. When you go to the grocery store, those profits get eroded. Support your farmers market. How do people change this?
You can turn it around for yourself today and society tomorrow. That's really what I'm arguing. When you see the benefits for yourself, you can't unsee them. The market will respond to buying power.
Yeah, and I definitely notice a lot of people our age and information age, social media, becoming aware of these things. But yeah, some people are going down the vegan path, and there's all these different... People know something's wrong though, don't they?
People are looking at how they fuel themselves. I personally think that if you're travelling the vegan path, you're well-intentioned. You've got a personal health agenda, you've got an awareness of the environment and animal rights.
Yeah.
My concern is that animal rights agenda, the environment agenda, has been actually again hijacked by particularly the cereal and grain industry. The processed food industry is completely behind it. That whole vegan message is actually had its origins with the Adventist Church, who were writing that message for fruits, nuts and seeds.
Yeah.
And in 2012 to 2014, they combined with Coca-Cola and the International Life Sciences Institute, which is the science arm of the food industry, to press the accelerator button on all of this disinformation.
Yeah.
So when you drill down on it, I'm concerned you can just have a plant-based diet to fulfil a healthier eating pattern. It's certainly better than the standard Australian diet of crap food.
Absolutely.
But it's really hard to maintain, and you need to, in fact, be supplemented with a fair amount of stuff. Whereas if you introduce some animal into there, hopefully pasture-fed,
naturally caught fish, something like that.
Holistically raised, and you don't need a lot, then you're going to get the whole balance. And I think you're right, they're worried about their health, they're worried about their family's health, their parents' health. They can see that something's not right, and people are searching for that information. You don't have to believe me, I'm just one of those questioners out there, but every time I've literally poked this, the house of cards has come tumbling down. Doesn't matter if it's sugar or carbs or metabolism or fibre or the gut microbiome or the only thing that's been consistent is the vested interests that have been there for 100 years shaping our medical education. And when you keep seeing that crop up and up and up and up, we're calling it out.
Yeah, and I think well-intentioned is the right way to put it. Like, I've got friends that are doctors, and they're doing what has been told them, what is in the textbooks, what they have to do by law, and that still doesn't necessarily mean that's the right way to get the best outcome for your patient.
Well, guidelines are the things we're supposed to adhere to. Guidelines are written by people with vested interests, and we can identify that for decades. Guidelines mathematically are there for the median group. The median group's about two-thirds of the population, which leaves a third of the population that they're not applicable to.
Yeah.
But if you don't follow the guidelines, then your medical board will come after you, or can come after you. And that's been my journey over several years. But now I'm innocent.
Yeah, and I found that as well. Like, if I was trying to educate people on this in the real world, but what's the best case outcome for that patient is that they get healthy and they get off all their medications. That's a number of scripts. That's less profit for my boss. That's less sales for Kellogg's. That's what we see people coming after us pretty aggressively.
And it's protected. But also the politicians are not keen to travel that path because the lobbyists are in their ears. Their dollars directly and indirectly come from those industries and the voters. This is the biggest market disruptor of all time, our health. And if our health is primarily determined by what we eat, which it is, I'm calling for us to restructure the whole lot. That's incredibly damaging. But if this has actually been complicit behaviour by the food industry and the vested interests, then this is insider trading like we've never seen before. If you've got a product, and I'll come back to a local company here, Sanitarium, which is wholly owned by the Adventist Church, producing breakfast cereal and Up and Go, which is full of sugar and chemicals, trying to get that into schools and school breakfast programs, is in cahoots with the Heart Foundation, which is encouraging us to eat it. But they're also the ones writing the dietary guidelines, but they're also the ones writing the algorithms for the health star rating in Australia, so that all the processed food industry. Now, if that isn't a compromised, total conflict of interest at so many layers, now that's actually been. Now, I can give you the same story with Coca-Cola. I can give you the same story with Nestle.
I mean, I remember reading about this in the US. I know Michelle Obama was trying to fight this, and then she just couldn't. There was too much money, so she changed her message from the diet to get active and do more exercise. But I remember the lobbyists fought them when they were trying to get fruit and veg into the children's canteens, and they got the laws written as they have to have 2 vegetables a day. So then the lobbyists got potato chips and tomato paste on pizza to count as and again, this all comes back to the profits, whether that's insider trading indirectly or not, I'm not sure. But it really is crazy, isn't it?
I'm using the term loosely. The term exercise is medicine. A lot of people have heard exercise is medicine, in one form or another, life being a program. But the term exercise is medicine has actually been patented by Coca-Cola. And so they've literally been moving us down this whole pathway to what I call the Church of Coca-Cola, which Belinda does, the Adventist Church who are writing the dietary guidelines, to having us down a pathway of move more, eat less meat.
Yeah.
And if you listen to the dietary guidelines of the world at this point in time, which is cereal-based, anti-meat, anti-dairy, have more fruits, nuts, seeds, becoming that vegan vegetarian, that's the agenda. Move more, eat less meat.
My favourite movie of all time is The Matrix, Gary, because I think the world we're living in is people that have taken the red pill and they're awake and you're doing the best for their family, financially, whether it's the financial education we talk about. There's just this inequality and of information as well as what's actually going on around people. So I really think people that are doing this, the odd ones out at the moment, but hopefully one by one we convert people.
Well, that was why it was the topic of my talk in the US. Do you want the red pill or the blue pill?
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated because it's the history. I don't like being conned. And I think we've all been conned. My textbooks, my teachers were conned. And I ended up, my students, I tried to actually let them know, and the university, started taking away my lectures. So therefore they're now on YouTube. But then I realised the system's going to try and, change that. And we already know in that low-carb community, the algorithms are changing against us.
Oh, yeah.
So analytics, when you look at that, and I'm not just the only person, when you chat around the world to people who are actually talking about this, analytics are harder, and so, but what isn't harder is that the one-on-one, the person who actually makes the change today for their own health, you can't stop them from telling the rest of the family.
Or the person that likes the video, leaves a comment, and actually shares it with a friend, says, "Watch this," because people searching for this, YouTube isn't going to push these results that it doesn't have the right ads and sponsorship and gets the right message across. So we definitely see that coming. We've spoken about so many topics. We had requests for so many more, but I wanted to stick to that today. And I think, again, I want people at home to do their own research and not read too far into conspiracies just because someone says something. Try and read as much as you can about a topic. Try and look for experts in their field that have been converted, that were the doctors that said, I was doing this wrong for 20 years because of this.
And I'm one of them. I've apologised to my patients. I've apologised to our children. I got it wrong. And I don't think I'm stupid. I just believe what I was told.
Yeah, and I've certainly learnt a lot, even just this year, from doing a bit more down the rabbit hole about all this stuff. So, Gary, I think that's fantastic. I hope you guys have appreciated that. We'll have to have you on again in the future. I'm sure we're going to get so many questions and comments. So I hope you guys have really enjoyed that. And thanks for going.
Hopefully it didn't, challenge you too much.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.